Just in case you're new to the channel or new to the church, I'm Pastor Josh Laborious. I'm the senior pastor here at Hope Lutheran Church in Friendswood, Texas. And this summer of 2026, for anyone who's maybe watching this video as an archive thing, in our Sunday morning Bible class, we are going through a series we're calling The Extras, using our stories to tell God's stories. And the idea behind this, first of all, the title itself is a recognition that even as we go through our lives, even as we have our experiences and we garner these stories that we then get to tell, we are never the main character. We are extras in this story that God has been working on that spans from the beginning of creation all the way until Christ returns. But within that, we do have our own experiences, and we walk through our lives, and this is where the story part of it comes, is as we're talking with other people, especially people who are outside the faith or who have questions about the faith, and we come across these questions, sometimes those can be really difficult questions to answer, and there's some instinct in us that we want the right answer. We want to know what the book says. We want to know what the textbook answer might be, and those answers aren't always as helpful as we think they might be. So through this series, which will be 11 weeks, it'll be 11 videos as well, our goal is to hone and practice and learn more about telling our stories as ways to communicate, to share, and to tell God's story. So while these videos are hopefully very helpful to you, whether you're watching them because you can't be here on Sunday, or you're watching them as a review for Sunday, or whatever other reasons bring you here, I do hope they're helpful for you, but I do feel obligated to note that these videos are a second best option. If you are at all able, being here on this campus, in this place, as we're teaching the class, if you're watching this anywhere close to real time, will be better. Because part of telling stories is your audience. It is who you're telling the stories to. It is the people you're talking with. And when we come together on Sunday morning and we do this in a class setting, we get an opportunity to practice that and to think through that and to maybe even get some feedback on that. Whereas if you're just watching this video by yourself, you will still learn, hopefully, but you don't necessarily have that opportunity in the moment to practice and to get feedback and that kind of thing. So that I'm not going to make a big deal of that through the rest of the videos. Just here in the introduction, I thought it would be appropriate to say, if you can be there in person. We're doing these videos because there are a handful of you folks, and maybe you're watching this, who have a lot of interest in the study itself, but for one reason or another aren't actually being able to be there this summer on campus. So we're putting these videos together. They're going to be a little bit different than the Sunday mornings because the Sunday mornings involve a lot of that discussion, a lot of that practice, and while it may feel like I'm talking to you, I am talking to a camera right now. And so there will be moments in these videos where I'm going to invite you to pause and take some time and answer a question. If you're watching this or listening to this with someone else, or if you are sitting and you're listening and watching this by yourself, to just pause and think about how you would answer that question or how you would talk through the answers to that question. Okay, so that's kind of what this is going to look like. Welcome to the extras. We hope it's beneficial for you. So, with those introductory things out of the way, the first thing that I am going to invite you to pause and take a couple minutes and think through or talk through is just, what is one of your favorite memories? and tell that story. And especially if you're sitting with someone else, share that favorite memory with them. You can pause the video, so I'm just going to keep rolling. Having that experience of sharing your favorite memories is where we want to start this idea of, through this series, the idea is that sharing your faith, talking about your faith, becomes as easy as sharing that memory is. Because for most of us, it might be difficult to pick a favorite memory, but it's usually not very difficult to talk about it. If it's a favorite memory, it's something that you cherish, it's something that was very positive and enjoyable, and it's something you look back fondly on. And for most of us, it's pretty easy to talk about those things. And the goal is to get to the point where talking about our faith feels kind of like that. That doesn't necessarily mean all of the conversations are going to be easy, but we can certainly get more comfortable in having those conversations. But before we get into this series, before we get into all of the different stories that we're going to practice telling and all the different things we're going to think about that go into those stories, and how do we tell those stories, what details do we include, that kind of thing. We do want to lay some ground rules for these kinds of conversations, and we're going to start we're going to lay 4 pretty basic rules down, and I don't think any of these are controversial. None of these should be particularly surprising. Hopefully they're not too challenging, but we're going to lay them down nonetheless. All right, the very first rule we have for these sorts of conversations: be honest. And you might say, well, that's kind of obvious. Fair enough. But when it comes to conversations where we're talking about our faith, and we're having these conversations with other people, honesty can be more difficult than it sounds. Because a lot of the time, our conversations about our faith are moments of vulnerability for us. They are times we realized we weren't enough and we needed God. It was times when we were confronted with how sinful and broken we are and we needed grace. And when we come up to those conversations, we might not outright lie about them, but the temptation is very real and the temptation is very strong to tell the story in such a way that it downplays our weakness. And in that, I would remind you of some of Paul's words in his letters, where he revels in his weakness. He says, I will boast in my weakness, because in my weakness, God's strength is shown more fully. So we have to be honest with our conversations about the faith, even in moments where that is hard, even in moments where we feel vulnerable as a result. And I made this note when we walked through this in Sunday morning, but I'll make it again here. This is especially true with kids. Because if you give your kids the impression that you have never struggled with your faith, or you've never gone through those weak moments in your life, when they do, there's going to be this reaction of, am I not faithful enough? Is there something wrong with me because mom and dad didn't do this? Mom and dad didn't have to go through something like this. Why do I have to? So we have to be honest about our vulnerabilities and our struggles, because in there we can also teach our kids how God overcomes those things. So with kids, it's especially important because you're laying a foundation, and it can be especially difficult because no parent wants to admit stuff like that to their kid, usually. And this is true for adult children as well. This conversation actually kind of came up after class last week. What about adult children who have fallen away from the faith, or adult children who are struggling with some of these questions? That honesty and transparency is even more important at that point. especially because in some of those cases, whatever issue they may have with Christianity might be a result of their experience as a kid. A pretty easy example to point to is if a child grows up in the faith and it's all about the rules. It's all about you're a Christian, which means you do this and you don't do this, and this is how you live, and it's all about moral, ethical behavior. Then if they grow up and they see ethics and they start to think about ethics or morality or right and wrong in a different way, and it's so intricately and intimately connected with the faith, then that chasm is going to be really hard to overcome. And you say, well, what does this have to do with the honesty and the transparency? Because it's at that point that as a parent, and this can be an insanely difficult thing to do, but you need to have the honesty to admit, hey, I didn't emphasize the most important things as you were growing up. Because the most important thing about Christianity is not the rules. It's not the ethical teaching. It's not the morality. Like, that is not the core of Christianity. It's a part, certainly, and it's an important part. But the central piece of Christianity is Jesus Christ died for our sins, resurrected from the dead, promises us eternal life. Like, that is the core of the gospel. And sometimes when we are tempted to put the focus of Christianity elsewhere, it creates obstacles. And if you have an adult child who that obstacle has become insurmountable, the first step in that conversation frequently can be admitting, I kind of put this obstacle in front of you, and I need to apologize for that. And that's honesty, that's transparency, that's a hard conversation. But so that's rule number 1. Be honest. Rule number 2, focus on why it mattered to you more than what happened. When you're talking about your experiences with the faith, when you're talking about the different things that you've been through, obviously maybe the bulk of the story that you tell is what happened. But the most impactful parts of that story are how you experienced it. So how did these different things make you feel? What were you going through up in your head as you were going through this life experience, as you were having these religious thoughts and conversations and whatever else goes along with the story? Because that subjectivity is wildly impactful. It makes the story so much more real. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a little bit. The third rule is avoid jargon. This one's pretty straightforward. There are a lot of church words that we use. And they're great words. They're very helpful words. There's a reason they become prevalent in our conversations and how we talk. Words like righteousness and sin and the Trinity. And they're these religious words that if you use them in a non-religious context with people who aren't familiar with them, they can mean a lot of different things. So maybe the best way to do it is to think, how do we use language that will be easily understood by whoever you may be talking to? And not just do they know what the word means, but do they know how Christianity uses the word? Do they know the connotations that come along with it? Okay, so maybe we simplify our language a little bit. And if there is a word that is so useful and so helpful that we need to lean on it as we're sharing our stories, as we're talking through these different questions about our faith, take the time to pause and explain those words. So if you're going to use the word sin, pause and say, when I say this word, I mean anything that separates us from the will of God. Okay? And then the last rule for these conversations, you have be honest, focus on why instead of just what, avoid jargon, and then the fourth rule is to listen actively. When you're having these conversations with people, listen actively. And by that I mean you are not in the discussion, you are not in the conversation just worried about what are you going to say next. You are genuinely, sincerely listening to the experiences and the questions and the comments that the other person has. And your first responsibility as you respond to them is not, what do you want to say? It is asking follow-up questions. It is making comments that express to them, hey, I was listening and I noticed this and this really stood out. And as you do that, you're going to learn more and more about where they're coming from, which is really, really important, because then when you start to share your stories and you start to share your thoughts and experiences, you can adjust those to what that person needs to hear because you've been listening and you have started to understand, at least in part, where they're at and where they're coming from. Okay? And not only that, you active listening earns you the right to in turn be listened to. Okay, so these are our 4 rules to kind of be an undercurrent for all these conversations. All right. As we go through the rest of the study, a little bit more background on it. We're going to be at different times focusing maybe on some different audiences and thinking about, well, where does our emphasis need to be? What do we need to talk about more or less for different specific audiences? Okay. So some of the audiences that we're going to highlight. The first is actually Christians, other Christians. How do we talk about our faith with each other? And that's a good conversation to have. The next would be Christians who are struggling. And this is going to be different because this is someone who maybe they have some questions or some doubts about their faith and they're trying to deal with it. How do you talk to them? How do you share your stories with them in a way that is helpful and supportive to them? And that conversation is a little bit different than the Christian because they're struggling with something. So you want to focus in ways that are going to help and serve them in wherever they're at. But it's also different from a lot of these groups that will follow because there is at least a foundational commonality in that they are Christian, they believe in God, they believe in Jesus, they believe in what he did. So there is that common ground, and that can open up a lot of the conversations and give us some freedom in that. Continuing down our list, we'll talk about folks who are open to the idea of Christianity. They're not Christian themselves, they maybe haven't gone to church or anything, but they're open to the idea of it. They'd be willing to check it out, learn more, and they're even open to this concept of faith. So this would likely be a more relaxed conversation, but you don't have as much of that common ground necessarily as the previous categories because while they're open to the idea of God and Christianity, they're not there yet. Okay? And then continuing down, we have those who are apathetic. This is similar to the open in that they can be pretty relaxed conversations, but there's not a lot of shared background. And then we continue on. We have someone who's antagonistic to the faith. This is one of the trickier conversations to have because there are going to be a lot of challenges, and you're going to have to work in those conversations to understand where is this person coming from, why are they antagonistic to the faith, because a lot of your conversations about the faith, you're going to want to start with what's their problem. Did a church treat them poorly? Did a Christian treat them poorly? Are they really frustrated with some specific aspect of Christianity that they have come across in their life experience? And based on what the source of their antagonism is, your approach to those conversations is going to change. Okay, and then 2 other categories, the other religions. This would be your Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, pagans, Norse pagans, I heard Zoroastrianism's making a comeback in some parts. So these other religions, and this is where that fourth rule is pretty important. Listen actively, because you're going to want to know, where are they coming from. Uh, what is their relationship with their religion? What led them into that? And kind of where they're at in their existing religion, because that allows you to speak more effectively to where they're at. Um, and then the other group, and this actually has been added since the actual class the past Sunday, based on some feedback, is adult children who have fallen away from the faith. And a very closely related category is just folks who have fallen away from the faith. Christians who were once Christians but aren't anymore, so they probably know a lot about the faith. But again, that active listening is going to be really important. What led them to step back? What led them to step away? So these are some of our different audiences. That's probably not a all-encompassing list, but they're broad enough categories. It's probably pretty good. Okay, and as we go through the rest of this series, you're going to want to keep in mind some of these different audiences, especially as you think about the people in your life that you are likely to have faith-related conversations with, or that you hope to have faith-related conversations with. You're going to want to think about, well, how does this change for these different audiences, okay? Shifting gears a little bit, with some of this groundwork laid, I want to go to Galatians 2. Now, in Galatians 2, this is Paul writing, he says, "After 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up because of a revelation and set before them, though privately before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. But even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. Yet because of false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so they might bring us into slavery. To them we did not yield in submission even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. And from those who were seen to be influential, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised, worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do." This is Paul telling a story, saying, he sets the stage. He says, after 14 years, I went to Jerusalem. I met with these folks. These are some of the conversations we have. This is where we led. And he's just telling about his experience. He's telling a story. But in there, if you catch, he buries a lot of truth. And in telling his experience, he is telling a story that communicates, among other things, that the gospel is going out to the Gentiles, and it should be going out to the Gentiles. In this story, he is also validating his ministry, because he's saying, I had these conversations with leaders in the church, and they approved. They extended to me the right hand of fellowship. Okay? And this leads us into the reason this is how we're approaching these conversations. It's the power of story. Because stories are real in a way that facts aren't. And that's not to deny objective truth. That's not pushing back on the value of knowing facts. But when we tell a story, there's so much more that gets caught up in it, because there is emotion. There is empathy. People start to identify with different experiences we've had, and they'll think about experiences they've had that line up with that, and we start pulling in the same direction and going in the same direction. They can add details that you just won't get on a fact sheet. And in fact, our subjectivity, when we tell our experiences, and it's not just here's what happened and here's what happened after that, and then boom, 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 here's the timeline. But we interject like this happened and this made me feel really angry, or this made me feel really happy, and I was really relieved about this, and we walk through the story through our perspective, with our lens of experience, and what we give into that, our subjective perception of these things that happened. It adds a dimension that a list of facts just doesn't have. And what's more is that makes it more real, that makes it more convincing and compelling. And often when we're led into these conversations, it's not because we woke up that morning and decided, we're going to have this conversation today. It's because someone came to us looking for something. And in that, people don't come to us usually looking for the right answer. If they wanted the textbook answer, they would look on the internet. They would Google it, or they would go ask an authority. So maybe they would go to the local church, or they'd talk to a local pastor. Oftentimes people, they don't necessarily want that right answer as much as they want your answer. If you're having a conversation like this, they know you, they trust you, they care about you, and they know that you care about them, and to all of this to some extent. And they want to know your answer to all of these questions about the faith, to questions like, why do you believe? Is Jesus the only way? How did you come to faith? What has God done for you? What has this faith changed for you? How does this change how you deal with struggle and conflict, and how has it led you in different parts of your life? They don't want the right answers. They want your answer. So give it to them. And then we're going to kind of close with two more things. The first is the situations where these kind of conversations, the situations we're going to be targeting over the next 11 or the next 10 sessions. Usually these conversations are going to fall into two categories. The first is missional. We want to share the faith. We want to keep people out of hell. We want to bring people into this knowledge of who Jesus was and what he did and what it means for their eternal salvation. So we prepare ourselves to have these conversations with the hope that the Holy Spirit works through our words to bring people to faith. And then the other situation where this comes up, these kind of conversations will come up, are counseling situations, our supportive friendship situations where you have a friend who is struggling with something, and this is how you support them. This is how you share wisdom with them. This is how you share words of comfort and peace with them. So those are kind of the two predominating situations we're going to keep in mind through these next 10 sessions. And then what I want to close on here, this video that you are watching right now is on the YouTube channel for Hope Lutheran Church. And as such, it's good for us to think through, like, what is the path to getting connected at Hope? And if you're watching this and you're a member of Hope, then I pray that you keep this in mind as we try to bring more people to that saving knowledge of faith and the supportive community that the church is around that faith. And if you're watching this and you're not a member of Hope, like, consider this your invitation. These are some of the different ways to get connected, to get plugged in. And once upon a time, when the majority of the country was Christian, when people were trying to bring folks into the church, you weren't really usually sharing the faith with non-believers. You were convincing Christians to join your church instead of another church. To kind of put it in other terms, you're getting folks to pick a brand. And advertising, impersonal advertising, is very good at getting people to pick a brand. But if the person has absolutely no interest in the item being sold, they don't really care what the brand is, and advertising isn't necessarily going to convince them that they need it. It takes something more. Oftentimes it takes something personal. So with that, you also had this idea that worship was a good starting point. Like Sunday morning worship was, if you're going to come to church and you're going to do one thing and you're kind of new, Sunday morning worship, that's where we're going to start. And if most of the people coming in as visitors or as guests or potential members are already Christian, that does make a lot of sense because they get it. But if we're focusing on people who don't believe, or people who have fallen away from the faith, or people who believe, who may be Christians, but they don't see any need for the institutional church, Sunday morning worship makes very little sense as a starting point. Because if you come in and you don't really believe, and you come into a Sunday morning worship service that is built around praising and worshiping and receiving forgiveness from this God, the question is like, why am I doing this? So instead, here at Hope, the path that we've kind of charted out, especially from, we'll say, non-belief into faith, starts with the community. This is why here at Hope, the Fellowship Task Force has been working so hard to make sure that at least once a month there's something that is easier to invite friends to. So things like a bowling night or a trivia night or something like that. Just so you can invite someone in and they can start to get to know the community and build some trust and realize, okay, these people aren't insane. Maybe we should learn a little bit more. And then from there, the next step is, maybe to come to a small group meeting or a Bible class or something like that to learn. And you might say, well, why not just Sunday morning? Well, here's why not just Sunday morning worship. Because there is learning that happens there, but there's not a whole lot of opportunity to ask questions and to say, wait, can you slow down on that part? Hey, can you go back to that part? What about this? What about that? But if you go to a small group or you go to a Bible class, there is that opportunity to say, I don't get this part. Or why is this way? And after there's that at least kind of a ground level understanding of here's who God is, here's what he has done, here's why we thank him, then we start to make this transition. Okay, now we get that. Now let's worship and praise him for what he's done. So instead of viewing Sunday morning worship as our entry point, I would encourage you in these conversations with non-believers or with Christians who are disenfranchised or disillusioned with the church, to view worship instead as a second or a third step in this process of getting someone involved with this formative community that revolves around cultivating faith, strengthening faith, supporting faith, sustaining faith in Jesus, who is the Christ. So with all that being said, if you have any questions, if you have any follow-up that you want to discuss, you can always reach out to me individually, or there's a comment section. You are free to use it. It does get checked. I do look at it at least a couple times a week, and happy to deal with questions, happy to respond as much as we can. And I hope these videos are a blessing to you. Go in peace, serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.